Once again, it's Casual Friday. Just like with my Technique Tuesday videos, I'll have a couple of links down in the description if you want to jump ahead in the video. So today I have one finished object. It's a pretty big one. It's one that I first started back in 2006. And then I want to tell you about my knitting grandmothers. So the project I finished is, I'm going to try to stand up and show you all the parts of it. There's no way, I don't think, for me to get the whole thing in the camera at one time, but we'll try. So this is the Lizard Ridge blanket. Let's see, can I get most of 4 squares in this shot? And it's 4 squares wide and 6 squares long. You can kind of see from side to side, and then I'll turn it upside down. So that you can kind of get a sense from here. And I doubt that the color is showing up correctly. The purples and reds and blues tend not to show up really well. So the Lizard Ridge, there's another shot of it. Ooh, I love it. So the Lizard Ridge blanket is a free pattern from Knitty. It came out in the fall 2006 issue of Knitty. And I'm pretty sure I saw it almost right away because my copy of the pattern, I think I have it. Where is my copy of the pattern? I don't know what I did with my copy of the pattern. Oh, it's over here. So I have the original printout I made. It was back when we had a color printer. We don't anymore. But I printed it out on September 26, 2006. And the idea with this blanket, if you're not familiar with it, is that you take advantage of Noro Kurion yarn, which has very long color changes. That you knit these squares. They're essentially these squares are essentially stripes. So you use one end of the ball of yarn to create the stripe, and then when that stripe is finished, you switch to the other end of the ball. So gradually you're shifting. You're using the yarn as you're working toward the center, but you never quite reach the center. It doesn't take a full ball of yarn to work any particular square. But in the process of knitting these stripes, you do a series of short rows, and that's what creates the little bubbles, and then they're offset from each other with one color versus the other. So the idea is, you can take whatever colors of Noro Kurion that you want, even if you use the same colorway more than once, which I did, the squares aren't going to look exactly the same. So I loved this project when I first saw it, and the idea that you just pick whichever colors of Kurion that you like and mix them, use them however many you want as you find colors that you like, and then eventually you can sew them all together, and then you put this border around it. Well, so this was in the fall. So I knit the first square probably soon after I printed out the pattern. I went to the yarn shop and I bought probably 6 different colors of Kurion, and I really had to check the labels to make sure that they were different colors, because they can look different in the ball. So I picked anything that had really bright, pretty colors that I liked, and I stayed away from some of the duller shades. And so there were 6 or 7 different colors that they had at the shop, and I bought those. And I knit the first square, and I'm pretty sure that was one of the first times I'd ever knit with wrap and turn short rows. I may have tried knitting a sock heel, like a short row sock heel at some point, and just hating the process. And I'm more of a heel flap and gusset person because of fit issues. But so I think this may have been the first project where I used wrap and turn short rows, and I did not love wrap and turn short rows. And so I did the square, and it was completely about the process. When we talk about process knitting and product knitting, this was definitely a process project because I didn't need a blanket. I didn't have somebody to give it to, and there was no deadline. I just wanted to try this out because I thought it was so neat. And you know, after last week when I talked about being colorblind, this is the kind of thing that works for me to use a lot of colors because I'm not picking out the colors in the skein of yarn, so I can assume that they really do go together and I don't have to make any decisions other than I like that ball of yarn, I like that ball of yarn. So it's sort of like with self-striping sock yarn where I can get some really wild socks, but I don't have to pick the colors out. So it's that same idea. So I really liked the idea of this blanket, but had no reason to continue doing it. So I did one square in 2006. And then in 2011 is when I found the German short row technique in Big Book of Knitting and wrote the article about it and did a video on it in June of 2011. And I was using German short rows when it made sense. I was designing some things with it. But I never had returned to the Lizard Ridge, probably just wasn't on my mind. And then when the article actually was printed or published in October of 2011, then of course there was a lot of buzz about it. People were asking questions. And I believe somebody said something about, oh, I want to figure out how to use this for the Lizard Ridge blanket. And I thought, oh, that's a great idea. And I still had this printout of the pattern, and I had those balls of yarn in a bin with the original square that I hadn't done anything with. So I figured out how to convert the wrap and turn short row patterns to German short row instructions, and I knit a square with it, and it worked out great. And I thought, well, that was a lot of fun. And so I knit another one, and I knit another one. So I was using up all of the yarn that I had bought years ago. And I decided, oh, okay, I'm going to buy the rest of the yarn that I needed. So I was looking at all the color ways that I had, the color numbers that I had bought 5 years before. And I went back to the shop, and they had maybe one or two of them, maybe. And I don't know if they had any, but they didn't have nearly as many different colors of Kurion as they used to. They had a lot of silk garden. People were knitting with that instead. So then I went online just to see what I could get, and some of the colors that I had purchased before were discontinued. So like, oh, now what I'm going to do? So the ones that were still being sold, I bought more of those, and then I found other colorways that I really liked and bought several balls of each of those. So I bought enough yarn to finish the project. But then once I got all that yarn, I only knit a couple more squares. So I was up to 8 squares at this point in 2011. And then in 2016, when I did that massive UFO search and looked at how much knitting I had and devoted the year to pretty much finishing up old projects, I knew I probably wouldn't finish the blanket, but I wanted to finish the squares. So I would do 1 or 2 squares. I'd finish some other project, then I'd do 1 or 2 squares. I'd finish some other project, do 1 or 2 squares. And I was doing them often enough that I could really remember what to do. I didn't have to keep referring back to the instructions. But they were separated enough that I didn't feel like I was getting tired and sick and tired of doing the same thing over and over again. So I did finish all the squares. In 2016, they were sitting in this bin. And I think at that time, yes, I'm sure of it, because I had all of the squares. And you have to use a different yarn for the border. And in the pattern, they called for Cascade 220, which is a worsted weight, almost toward DK end of the scale, where the Noro Kurion is more toward the Aran weight. So just about a weight class different, at least. And it was crocheted, which I don't crochet, but I needed to get the yarn. I didn't know what color yarn I should get to sew it up and then do the border with. So I took all the squares in and I threw them all on the floor at the yarn shop, and then I got help from the manager. She's always really good helping me with colors. So I had the yarn that I was going to use for that, and it was all in the bin. And so then a couple of weeks ago, I started doing the seaming of the bits, and I kind of looked at, well, what do I actually have that are the same colors and they're different colors. So the way the instructions recommend sewing everything up is to do a strip of 3 of the squares. So do strips of 3 squares, and then when you have 2 strips of those, then you seam those up together, and that creates a quadrant, because then you'll have 6 squares and there's 24 altogether. And so then you do another quadrant, another quadrant, another quadrant, and then you seam together the 2 top quadrants, you seam together the 2 bottom quadrants, and then you seam the 2 halves together. So I thought, okay, if I'm working with quadrants, what I saw was that I had a bunch of squares where I had 3 of the same color, of the colorway, and then I had a bunch that were just single squares. So I stacked them all up. I put all the singles on the bottom of the stack, and then I put the sets of 3 on top of that. And then it was like dealing cards to create 4 piles. So I'd go first color 1, 2, 3, and then the second color 4, 1, 2, and then the third color 3, 4, 1, like that, until I just kept distributing them around like that. And then once I had the 4 piles, then I kind of looked at each group of 6 and figured out what I was going to do for strips of 3. And when I had all my strips of 3, then I wanted to make sure that when I was figuring out my quadrants, that I wouldn't have 2 squares that were the same colorway that would be on a seam together. So I did all that, and then I had to do the border, and I'm not a crocheter. I have learned to crochet over the years in order to do a little edging here and there. The only thing I can ever remember how to do is a slip stitch and a single crochet. Get above that, and then I'm like, when do I yarn over? How many times do I pull through? I always have to look it up. So years ago, and I thought I just need to learn how to crochet, I got this book, Crocheting for Dummies, and I've heard the Knitting for Dummies one is really good. I've never looked at it, but this is it's really well laid out, and so this is helpful. So I had to take this out. I was trying to decide, do I want to crochet the border? I mean, I'm not a crocheter. Is that how I want to finish this off, is using a technique that I'm really not good at? So I tried different ways of doing an applied I-cord, and I tried this thing and I tried that thing. And the real problem with this blanket is that it's knit in stockinette. So it kind of doesn't matter what edging you put on. The edges are going to want to roll to the purl side at the sides, and they're going to want to roll to the knit, the top and the bottom. So I thought, well, I-cord is so close to the edge that the rolling is going to be pretty obvious. So I'm gonna try the crochet. And so I had to figure out what hook to use. I mean, they recommended hook size, and it was so different from the needle size. I was like, is that common? I just don't know how to mix knitting and crocheting, and I know it's a matter of gauge, but I need a starting point to know where to go up and down. So eventually I did do the edging, and it does roll a little bit, but it's not bad. I did an okay job with it. I'm not displeased with it. I don't think anybody's going to give me an award for being a master crocheter, but I was pretty happy with it. But what's funny is, I'm doing this crochet, and I'm like, I am not a crocheter. But then I realized, I have another sort of rainbow colored blanket in my house, because I've been thinking, what am I even going to do with this? I'm like, well, I have a rainbow blanket already. And it's crocheted by my paternal grandmother, and it is total 70s. Like, could this be more 70s colors? So I have always loved bright colors and rainbows. When I was in high school, and this is on my bed all the time. I've had this for 30 years, and it's not going to fall. It's not going to ever. I'll be passing this on to my great-grandchildren probably. It'll still be around. When I was in high school, we moved to a new house, and I wanted to paint my room. And I had this idea. I wanted to do this rainbow thing because I loved rainbows. I wanted this rainbow design on my wall, and I came up with a sketch what I was going to do. And I bought these little cans of paint in different colors. And the house is really old. It had those old style like steam radiators. So I painted each of the I don't know if they're pipes or sections, whatever they are, each of those a different color, and so happy with it. And I had this comforter. It was a white comforter. It had these geometric lines of different colors that were rainbow colors. And so when I went to college, I took my comforter with me, um, and my roommate and I were trying to like, oh, how are we going to fix up our room? And I was telling her how at home I had this rainbow on the wall. And she's like, oh, we should do that. And I said, I still have so much of the paint left. Oh, we should do that. Now, we're not allowed to paint our dorm walls. That was against the rules, and there would be a fine for that. But I think we looked to find out, well, what the fine would be. And we're like, well, we could deal with that. So, so we painted this thing, and our RA was completely aware that we were doing this. At the end of the year, because we were going to be sophomores and we wanted to live in the same hallway, we could choose what room we wanted. We could move further down the hall and have a room with a sink if we wanted, but we decided we wanted the same room again because we wanted our rainbow. And so we didn't get fined that year because we were still going to be in the room. So at the end of our sophomore year, the RA came in, to evaluate all of the any damages. She had a clipboard, and we're like, oh, well, of course, the rainbow. And she's like, I'm not going to charge you for that. Are you kidding me? That thing is great. So we didn't have to pay the fine for that. And I think it stayed on the wall for several years before they finally just painted all of the rooms in the hall. But so I always loved rainbows. So I think it might have even been my freshman year in college that for winter break I went to visit my dad, and he had been to visit his mother earlier in the year, and she crocheted, well, she made this blanket, but that's where I got this blanket. She had a bunch of blankets, and she's, said pick two out for the kids. And so he knew I liked rainbows, so he picked that one out for me. And I have to tell you, I wasn't crazy about the color combination. But I took it and I've used it, and it's always on, in the winter, it's always on my side of the bed because I need that extra layer. When I've gone to Worldwide Knit in Public days, if they're out like in a park somewhere, if I didn't want to drag a chair, I would just take that blanket with me and sit on it. And then it's knitters, and they appreciate, that it's something from my grandmother. And so I just thought that was interesting that I sort of have the 70s version of a rainbow blanket. Now I've got my modern era version. And I kind of wonder what my grandchildren will think of that blanket. Now I'm pretty sure that my mother's mother learned to knit and crochet as a child. She was born in 1900 on a farm in Iowa. And I know that they did knitting and crocheting. But she was one of three girls. They had a much younger brother who came along years later. And she was the middle daughter, and she was kind of her father's boy. My grandmother hated cooking, was terrible at it. She annoyed her own mother anytime she tried to help. And so she'd just go out and help your father. And so Grandma was very, very strong, tall, skinny. She was 5'6", which for that generation was tall. It's how tall I am. And she was very strong, would pull weeds, and really enjoyed that physical activity. And then when she became a school teacher, so when she graduated from high school, she got her teacher certification, and then she had a rural one-room schoolhouse, 1st to 8th grade that she taught in. And then in about 1921, she and her parents and her younger brother moved to San Diego. My grandma's older sister got married in Iowa, and they were farming the family farm. And then her younger sister had gotten her teacher certification and had a school that she was teaching at in Iowa. So my grandmother and her parents and little brother were all in San Diego. And so Hubert was going to San Diego High School. My grandmother was going to San Diego Normal School. And Normal School was the name for a teacher's college. And it was all on the same campus as the high school. So my grandmother, she was very strong, really loved exercise and all that kind of thing. So I started doing genealogy a few years ago, and I found her yearbook from San Diego Normal School. She was on the basketball team in the 1920s, and I'd heard stories about her learning to swim. Like they had physical education requirements, and I'd heard stories about how in one class they were teaching them to climb ropes, and which I'd never been able to haul myself up a rope. She was halfway up the rope before she figured out, oh wait, I forgot to use my legs. I'm supposed to use my legs. She was just pulling herself up the ropes. She's so strong. So then they were required to take a swimming class. And she had grown up, it's supposed to be very modest. Like she had this dress, that came down here that her mother thought was way too low. So she goes to the swimming class, and they hand her the swimming suit, and she's like, oh no, that's much too small. I need a bigger size. Well, you get a bigger size of a wool swimming suit, and it just hangs down lower. So that didn't work. So she eventually learned what size swimming suit to wear. But in her first class, they had them standing in the pool and bending over, so they had their face in the water, and then they were learning, how to do the swimming, the arms. And she just pulled herself off and like made her way across the pool. And she was so excited and thrilled to the coach. Oh, I did it. I'm swimming. And he's like, oh yeah, not so good though. But his name was Henry Gunther, and he had what were called swimming baths, which is like a swimming pool. So, and he had the Sunset Swimming Club. So my grandma joined the swimming club, and I think her brother must have done it too, learned to swim. But within 2 years, she was one of the fastest women swimmers on the West Coast. And when I started doing genealogy, I'd seen her little trophies and I'd heard certain stories about things, but when I started doing genealogy and I started really like finding the newspaper articles that she's there in the newspaper, in her swimsuit, and she's won gold medal in this and won first place in that. And then when she finished the teachers college, then she went up to University of California Southern Branch, which is now called UCLA. But at the time there's just Berkeley and then Southern Branch in Los Angeles. And she joined the swim club there. She was swimming with Johnny Weissmuller. They asked her to be in one of his movies as a swimmer for something that she couldn't do. And then she was training for the Olympics, the 1924 Olympics, and then she got diphtheria. And that wiped her out for a while, and she couldn't do it. And then by the next Olympics, she was really too old to compete. So in the process of doing genealogy, I also had my grandmother's photo album that she had put together for my mother in the 1980s. She's like it must have been for my mom's 40th birthday, or 50th birthday? 50th birthday, maybe. My grandmother was asking her, well, what are you going to want? And my mom said, I just want a photo album of all of the different, of the whole family. So pictures of everybody, because my mom's an only child, and she just wanted pictures of the cousins and grandparents and all that kind of stuff. So my grandmother spent 2 years writing to the relatives, getting photos, getting copies of them made, and putting together this photo album. And it was in one of those old, they called them magnetic photo albums, where you pull the sheet of plastic back and it's kind of tacky and sticky. And she put it on there, and then she'd type up a address label, like the kind that you moisten. She would type up a label of who was in it. But it was set up like a family tree almost. I mean, there was like these family groupings, generation by generation. When I started doing genealogy, it was like this treasure trove of, now I understand some of the stories that my grandmother had told about her cousins growing up. And now I can see the faces and understand, and then I can connect it to my family tree. And it was like really a helpful thing. But I also recognized that this photo album that was nearly 30 years old is not acid-free. And I was really concerned about some of the older items in there, and the adhesives and things. So I wanted to redo the photo album and put it into an acid-free environment. And so I pulled, some of the photos are really difficult. I had to use certain solvents to get things off. And sometimes I found that on the back of the photo, there was more information than what Grandma had typed up on the little label. So there was a photograph of Elsie, my grandma's older sister, and her first little boy, Paul. You know, there's all these pictures of him as a baby, and then there'd be another picture to say same baby a little later. And so one of those pictures I turned over, and on the back it said Paul, something about Paul, and then the hat and the sweater were knit from the old red sweaters that you and Hubert sent from Henry Gunther's swimming club or something. So the swimming club that my grandma and her brother had joined, they had some kind of sweaters, the red sweaters. They sent them off to Elsie. She raveled them, knit them into a sweater and a hat, and here it is in this photo album. And I would have had no idea if I hadn't turned it over and looked at it. But it was like this other connection to all of these other events, which, you know, I thought was just so fascinating to me. My grandmother didn't, you know, she lived in San Diego, and then when she and my grandpa got married, and they had my mother, they moved to the Imperial Valley, which is inland from San Diego. It's just really close to the Mexican border. So she was not knitting and crocheting. My grandma's full-time school teacher. She sewed, and she taught my mother to sew, but she wasn't knitting and crocheting at that time. She didn't start knitting and crocheting until after she retired. And I have like all my grandma's patterns and books and things. I have her Learn to Knit book and her Learn to Knit to Crochet books that she bought in the 60s when she retired. But I do remember the things that she never crocheted anything for us that I can remember, but I do remember some very specific things that she knit for me. Like when I was in second grade, this is 1969, I had a pair of white vinyl go-go boots that came up to my knees, and my grandma knit me a poncho. And I can remember, I have this vivid memory walking to school in my go-go boots and my poncho, and I was just like the fashion queen. I was so pleased with myself. I wore that poncho for several years. And then my grandma used to knit my mother scarves when she was in graduate school. My mother always wanted these really wide scarves, about 12 inches wide, that she could wear kind of like as a hood and scarf, and then she'd wrap them, like she wanted them 8 or 10 feet long so that she could be completely covered when she's walking across campus. So if my mom got a new coat, then my grandma would make a scarf to go with it. And then when we were in middle school, my brother, he was like 12 years old, and he asked my grandmother to knit him a sweater. And it was this blue sweater that had a V-neck, and it had white and red in striping in the V-neck. And he wore it in his school pictures, like, you know, his 12-year-old, you know, and my kids, when they were that age, they did not want to wear anything that I knit. You know, it's like, no way. But he wore it, he asked for it, he wore it. And then when I was in later high school, my mother asked my grandmother to knit her a sweater. My mom's favorite color is yellow. And so my grandma knit her this sweater that was long. It's kind of like almost like tunic length sweater, and that had a cabled yoke and then a turtleneck. And I never cared anything about any of my mother's clothes when I was a teenager, but I loved that sweater. So I asked my grandmother, would you knit me a sweater like that? She's like, you know, she'd just gotten through this thing, and I didn't understand what knitting was, you know, like a project. She's like, well, okay, what color do you want? I said, I want the same color. So she had to knit a second huge, long yellow. She probably never wanted to see yellow yarn again. But I can remember being so happy with that sweater. I did wear it in high school, and I took it with me to college. And I can remember standing in the cafeteria line in the dorm wearing that sweater and thinking, I cannot believe that people aren't just coming up to me and complimenting me on this sweater. It is amazing. You know, when are they going to start, you know, noticing how great this sweater is? So those are the things that I remember my grandmother knitting me. And then, of course, I learned to knit toward the end of my college years. And by then my grandmother was like 85 years old, and I think she'd stopped knitting because she was always had a challenge getting a project started, like figuring out, what was going on. And I think had just kind of stopped knitting by then, but she hadn't stopped swimming. My grandmother was swimming all the way up into her late 80s. And when she couldn't swim anymore, like she swam a lot. Like I went to visit her in middle school. I was 13 years old and I went to visit them for a week or so. And she had me come with her to what she called the spa, which was her health club, her swim club that she went to. And I was 13 years old. I was, young and strong. And, she swam 20 lengths of every stroke. Like she just back and forth, back and forth. And I remember thinking, I would be lucky to be able to do 2 lanes, maybe 3, and then I would have been gasping. She's just amazing. And so when she couldn't swim anymore, she had an exercise bicycle. And in 1992, my grandpa was dying of prostate cancer and he was in the hospital, and my grandmother had pneumonia, and she was in the same hospital at the same time recovering from pneumonia when grandpa died. And so then she got transferred to like a rehab nursing home facility for a little while, before she'd return home. And so she had her exercise bicycle brought to the nursing home, and she had just ridden it, like that, on say a Friday. And she had, ridden her exercise bike like 15 or 20 miles. And then she had a big stroke that night, and a couple of days later was dead, 3 weeks after my grandpa died. So it was like totally unexpected. And then, so then when I came for the memorial service, my mother and I went through their apartment. They had moved so many times over the years, they didn't have a ton of stuff left. But I took all of I took her knitting basket. It was like a folding up basket thing that could just stand on its own on the floor. I took all her needles and her crochet hooks and all her knitting patterns. So, and the crochet hooks, they're like Susan Bates or something, or maybe there's one that's boy, but they're just the metal ones. The one that I like, this is blue one. It's a size I, but it has the price on it. It's 35 cents. Like none of the other ones had the price on them. And I think I used to have one that had a 10-cent price on it, but it was in a notions bag that I left on the airplane. I don't even want to go there. And then there's this other crochet hook, which is kind of interesting. And at first I was really excited about it. I thought, oh, is this like bone or something? It's plastic. But it's kind of an interesting, I don't even know what size it is, but it's kind of an interesting crochet hook. So I do have my grandma's crochet hooks. The knitting needles I ended up giving to my niece, who's a knitter and a crocheter. She was in college like 10 years ago. So I sent those all to her because they weren't needles that I would want to use, but I thought, well, she might be able to use them. And I sent her the knitting bag. I mean, she just loved that because she loves the knitting and crocheting, and she loves whole family history type of thing. So I knew that those were in good hands. But I kept the knitting patterns. And I like to go through them every once in a while and just kind of laugh at them because they're all from the 60s and the 70s. And they're just, like the hair and the makeup, just kind of like crazy. But I was looking at them today, getting ready for this video, and the sweater in the back, this one, it's like this cable sweater. It's just a basic cardigan. And I'm like, that's actually a really nice pattern. I like that. So I started looking through them, and I had never done this before because I don't have the things that my grandmother knit for me. I have this blanket that my other grandmother crocheted for me. And when I was 9, both of them, at the same birthday, they both sent me a Barbie doll with a bunch of clothes that they had sewed and crocheted, like ball gowns and like a crocheted suit with I'm sure that was my dad's mother, the crocheted suit with the little beret hat. Just loved all that stuff. And then I'd make shoebox houses and furniture and, do all that kind of stuff with them, and just dress and undress all the time. I just loved it. So I've gone through these patterns before. Like when I was learning to do argyle socks, I found this. I don't know that my grandmother ever knit a sock. but it's got like all of these great argyle socks. So I learned quite a bit about how argyle socks were knit, and then how brief some of these patterns are. Like they just, oh, just do this. I'm like, well, how do you do that? So so those are kind of fun. But today I went through the patterns, and so I don't have what my grandmother knit me, but I have all her patterns. This is the poncho pattern. I looked at this and I went, oh, I bet my poncho's in there. And I'm like, immediately I knew it was that one. I just knew it because I knew that's it. And so then I was looking at this, the hair and makeup is so funny. What do I see on the second page? That's the sweater my grandmother made for my brother in when he was in 7th grade. Exactly those colors. My brother even had glasses like that. He didn't have a pipe, but he had glasses. Oh, and here, look at this great sweater here. Look at this cable sweater. It's great. I love it. So I'm like, this is, some of the stuff in here is really, if you can get past the poses and the hair and makeup, some of this stuff is really great. And then there's that sweater my grandmother made twice. It's even in yellow. So so that was a really amazing thing. Now, the other thing that happened when I started doing genealogy is that, I started getting back further and further. Like, we didn't know any of these people, didn't know stories, and I started figuring out who my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents were. And on my dad's side, we really didn't know anyone. Like, he did not know his grandparents' names. He had no idea who his father's parents were. And I eventually figured that out and moved my way back. And I discovered that both of my father's grandmothers were born here in Minnesota. And like, my brother moved here out of college. He got a job here, and I moved here because my brother was here when I was living in New Zealand, and my brother's not here. So I'm the only one here in Minnesota, and neither one of us had any idea that we had any connection to Minnesota. And it turns out we had ancestors who were here before Minnesota was a state. It was still a territory. So one of the things I discovered, once I started working my way back on my dad's side of the tree, and I discovered who my great-grandparents were, and that my great-grandmother was born here in Minnesota, and then who her parents were and who her parents were, then I started meeting online third cousins who shared these ancestors, and often they had photos. So, my parents were divorced, my father's parents were divorced, his parents all the way back, like divorced. All 4 sets of my father's great-grandparents were divorced, whether it was legally or just see ya and then let's marry somebody else. So that's a lot of broken connections where you don't hear the stories, or you don't get the photos, you just don't know what the history is. So, but this cousin, he collects living cousins and finds out what kind of photos they have. And he just had this huge treasure trove of these ancestors. And one of them was a woman she was born in Maine. I think it was Massachusetts at the time. It became Maine later, but she was a few months old and they moved to Wisconsin Territory like in the 1840s. Like, nothing was there yet. And then when she got a little bit older, they moved to Minnesota Territory. And she grew up on a farm. Her name was Hester Ann Sally. And she grew up on a farm next to the Bassett family. And they had a son named George Dempsey Bassett. Well, these two got married. The Bassett boys all served in the Civil War, and then that was about the time where Lincoln established the Homestead Act, where you could get 160 acres of land, and you had to stay on it 5 years. You had to improve it. You had to put buildings on it, build a well. You had to have your neighbors swear that you'd been living there and doing all this work, and then you would own the property, and you'd only have to pay like a small filing fee. So you could get land free by actually working it. So George Bassett and Hester Ann Sally got married. They had one child where they were living in Olmsted County. Olmsted County is where Rochester, Minnesota is, where the Mayo Clinic is. And so they had one child, and then they moved 100 miles west. There's no roads, there's no railroad. They just have to move there. And they moved with a lot of other young people, like brothers and sisters and neighbors and stuff who were all around their age and getting married. And then they all moved together to Faribault County in Sealy Township, and so there were several Bassett brothers in the area, and several of the Sally siblings were in the area, and so they moved there with their infant daughter, and they had 5 more daughters in this homestead in Faribault County. And this third cousin, Daniel, of mine that I found online, starts sending me all these photos, and then one day he sent me this one, which I'll put on the screen. And you can see what she has in her hands, and in her mighty big hands. And she didn't have any teeth, it doesn't look like. But she's knitting, and I can't really tell how she's holding her knitting. And she has a ring on her right hand, and I don't know if she wore her wedding ring on her right hand or if this is a mirror image, because sometimes those old photographs were mirror images of what was really going on. But she died in the early 1900s, and so she probably wasn't actually a whole lot older than I am now. She was probably in her early 60s here, but she looks quite a bit older because she did have 6 daughters out in the middle of the prairie in a log cabin with no running water. So that's an amazing photo that I have. And then as I was doing all this genealogy and looking through all these family photos, I also found a photo of my grandma, the one who knit me my poncho. I found a photo of her that my grandpa had taken, and there she is knitting, and I found out she was a continental knitter. So I just love the fact that even though I was never with my grandmothers when they knit or crocheted, that they both knit or crocheted things for me, and that I have these things. Oh, I'm getting choked up about it. And that I have these connections in my family history with the knitting, and it just makes me feel happy to have that. So that's it for today. And I'll see you next week. If you want to subscribe to my channel, I'll put my linky up here. And if you want to join me in my Ravelry group, that's called Rocks. And I'd love to see you there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.